Hey everyone, Tactics here, and with the war within just a few short weeks away, I figured it's time to give a quick rundown of all 6 tank specs to help you decide what you want to main in the new expansion. I'll be going over all of the major changes each of the specs have seen, as well as discussing their 2 hero talent options and how they affect their actual gameplay, and then in a future video next week, I'll probably be taking you through some of the tank trinkets, special effect weapons, and very rare loot available in Season 1, so make sure you are subscribed if you're interested in that content. Note that I will not be discussing overall power or ranking the tank specs in this video. Instead, I'm going to be focusing on the fun factor and just gameplay here, but I will be giving my full thoughts on their strength in a later video closer to launch once we see if any more tuning happens on beta. This is also probably a good time to remind everyone that every single tank spec in the game is capable of doing the hardest content, whether that's cutting edge raiding, pushing for the 0.1% title, whatever it is. So if you really enjoy the fantasy or play style of one of these tanks specifically, I will always recommend you play that because it is a game after all. Now, let's get into it, starting with Blood Death Knights, who've been a pretty hot topic recently because of one of the recent tank nerfs on the beta, so let's talk about that. The change in question is an adjustment to how Death Strike works, now allowing it to only heal you from damaging events that occurred in the past 5 seconds a single time, instead of allowing you to kind of double dip on that, meaning basically Death Striking back to back is significantly weaker than it was previously, and generally just something that you'll want to avoid. Now, I've seen a lot of people dooming about this change, but after extensive testing, I can honestly tell you this change does not nuke Blood DK sustainability. In fact, it's still the most self-sustaining tank and doesn't need to rely on a healer whatsoever. So if you're worried about that going away in the War Within, worry not. Aside from this, Blood also received substantial reworks to their class and spec talent trees. I'm not going to dive into the whole things in this video, as I've already covered that in my Blood DK preview over on my channel if you want to see it, but generally, you're going to get a few new toys here, and you also have some revamped old toys that were previously so weak that you did not take them. For example, AMS is now going to apply a smaller version to 2 nearby party members. That's pretty nice. Gorfian's Grasp is now significantly easier to grab with its position in the talent tree, and short cooldowns like Consumption, Bone Storm, and Blood Drinker have all received substantial buffs. Bone Storm specifically is now a very significant ability in Mythic Plus, as it consumes Bone Shield charges now instead of Runic Power to extend the effect, meaning it also provides CDR for your Rune Weapon along with Tombstone, giving you a bit of extra uptime. This was recently nerfed, as it now only does 5 stacks of Bone Shield as the consumption instead of 10, but still a nice boost of CDR nonetheless. When it comes to your hero talent trees, I think a lot of people are going to really enjoy Deathbringer, which has a lot of damage coming from Amps 2 Blood Plague, as well as some flashy animations. Basically, this tree gives you a new short cooldown in Reaper's Mark, which you put on your target, and then it detonates after you've done enough Shadow Frost damage to it, which empowers your next Mirror Rend to shoot out giant scythes at your targets. Anything in front of you basically gets hit by these, which looks super cool, and it actually makes Mirror Rend feel very nice to press, which is something it was definitely lacking throughout Dragonflight. I will say there are times where this makes the spec feel a tad bit bloated in terms of all these short cooldowns you have, especially if you're running things like Bone Storm and Consumption while being a Deathbringer, so there's a lot kind of upfront in your rotation, which feels a bit, clunky, but outside of that specifically, I really do enjoy it. To give you another option though, there is San Lane, which instead of giving you a new button, it empowers some of your existing abilities, namely Vampiric Embrace and Heart Strike. Basically, Death Striking has a chance to turn your Heart Strike into a Vampiric Strike, which gives you a small heal, it gives you a stacking haste buff, and it increases your target's shadow damage taken. It also has a chance to summon a Blood Beast to your side that explodes and does AoE damage after like 10 seconds, which is very cool looking. The Vampiric Blood interaction here, basically when it's up, your Heart Strike is just permanently this Vampiric Strike ability, so this defensive cooldown all of a sudden is a pretty significant offensive boost as well. It does sometimes put you in this weird situation where you want to keep Vampiric Striking for additional damage because it's better than Death Striking, and even though you're capped on Runic Power, you want to keep Vampiric Striking. It's odd at times, but generally, this is not happening all the time, so it seems okay. Overall, I think Blood DK has some really nice changes to their talent trees that definitely overcome the Death Strike nerf, which a lot of people have been worried about. So if you like to be always in control of your health at all times, this is still the best option for you. From there, let's talk about the other tank that received significant reworks, Brewmaster Monk, who like DK's had adjustments to both the class and spec tree, which again, won't go over here, but covered in my Monk preview, and it seems like a big goal of these changes was to reduce the button bloat of Brewmaster, which they were 100% successful at. As someone who didn't really enjoy how Brew played throughout Dragonflight, this may be the spec I'm most excited to play after all these changes in the War Within. In terms of buttons that are gone, Tiger Statue, that is no longer a thing. Bone Dust Brew, that is no longer a thing. Invoke Black Ox is completely avoidable now, and people do tend to avoid it on beta. And Special Delivery seems to be doing better than Rushing Jade Winds in a lot of situations due to the removal of Resonant Fist. So we're already down 4 buttons there, while still having an interesting, well-flowing rotation. And just like Blood, they've got a few more nice tools now, including Soothe as a paralysis, and the ability to do like a double jump dash after rolling, which is super fun to zoom around with, as well as a bunch of passive kind of defensive options that increase their stagger or give them healing in their spec tree, which were well needed. When it comes to hero trees, there's one hit and one miss for me, so let's start with the miss. I think Shadowpan just kind of feels like nothing. It's essentially just a bunch of passive buffs to your Cake Smash, to your Spinning Crane Kick. Occasionally you get like a random buff for 20 seconds, but you don't get to pick which buff you get, of course. It's from a selection of potential buffs. It doesn't really feel super impactful regardless, though, honestly, or give you anything that you're actually thinking about, which honestly, maybe that's a plus for some players. You just kind of set it and forget it, but personally I found it a bit boring. That being said, I absolutely love Master of Harmony, where your damage and healing kind of builds up this pool of vitality, and then you can spend that for bonus damage whenever you press Celestial Brew, which this tree gives you 2 charges of, which is really nice. You can do some pretty interesting things with this in Mythic Plus as well, like storing up a big pool of vitality on an AoE pull like just before a boss, and you go into this single target boss, and all of a sudden you have this massive pool of vitality that you can pump single target damage into. That's some cool skill expression, in my opinion. This tree also makes Cheebers just hit like an absolute truck, making it really satisfying ability, even though, again, that cast time on it does feel a tad bit clunky. In general, I think they've really hit the mark with this iteration of Brewmaster in terms of the core spec, and if the button bloat was something that was holding you back from trying this spec beforehand, I definitely would recommend giving it a go. Moving on, let's talk about the tank specs that have received minor updates in the expansion, starting with Guardian Druids, who saw just some minor shuffling in the class tree. This has both positives and negatives attached to it, so the big bonus here is that you can now easily access your Dispel no matter the content. However, your capstones, they still feel very weak compared to some other class and specs. There's still some very odd pathing choices, like you're forced to take CCs and Soothe in order to actually get to Stampeding Roar and even progress down the center of the tree. Just the crossing the tree just feels really bad still, so there's still a lot of issues here. Guardian's arms are also getting a bit shorter in the expansion, as all of the range extenders have actually been removed or drastically reduced for melee classes, so that includes Astral Influence here, no longer affecting your melee abilities, so a bit of a loss and will take some time to get used to. Outside of the class tree, there aren't any significant adjustments to talents for Guardian, so let's move on to the hero trees here, where there's been a lot of hype around Elun's Chosen. This tree basically doubles down on the Laser Bear playstyle for players interested in that, empowering your Moonfire, turning Thrash into arcane damage, making Lunar Beam an extremely powerful and short cooldown, and even giving you the ability to proc Fury of Elune beams on your enemies, so a lot of extra lasers here. Because it puts so much emphasis on Moonfire, it also kind of simplifies the bear rotation a bit, cutting out Swipe entirely, but honestly, pressing that button kind of felt bad anyway, so I'm fine with that. Would love to see some additional animations added, because this is pretty bland otherwise, because Lunar Beam is still, kind of hard to see. Fury of Elune still baseline animation. Thrash is still the baseline animation, even though it's arcane, so would love to see some adjustments in that department, but in terms of how it plays, it actually feels very good. Now, if you're someone who wants to avoid all of the lasers and just go back to your bare roots, there's also the Druid of the Claw tree, which is focused around the Ravage ability. This is an auto attack proc that empowers your next Maul to deal AoE damage around it and apply a large bleed to them in the process. A lot of talents also amp up this bleed specifically and allow you to extend it, so that's kind of the main gameplay here. You also get more procs during Incarn, as it allows your abilities instead of just your auto attacks to proc Ravage as well for the duration, so you do some really big damage during Incarn. I will say this tree does feel a bit odd for bear because it's kind of like clashing with things that already do the same thing, right? You've got ravage. It only replaces maul. It does not replace raise if you're spec into it. And basically it's just a better raise in all aspects. It does more damage. It also still applies tooth and claw to target hit, leaving you little reason to even talent into raise, even in AoE situations. It just generally kind of feels clunky with, two kind of procs coming from the same source. For anyone hoping for the return of cat weaving as well, like myself, unfortunately, this tree does fail to deliver on that, with only one weaving node that makes you want to cat shift for a single GCD essentially every 25-ish seconds, which only has potential also in pure single target situations. So very, very niche, and potentially it's not even the best in those situations either. Unfortunately, the great return of weaving doesn't look like it's coming in season 1, but maybe we can hope for some adjustments to that in the future. Overall, there's two distinct fantasies here for Guardian players, which is really nice to see. Whether you prefer to shoot out laser beams or bleed your enemies to death, you've got options here. Though outside of just minor adjustments to how you play the spec, it's very similar to how it was in Dragonfight. So if you enjoyed it then, you'll enjoy it in the War Within. Next up, let's talk about the prots, starting with Paladins, who are the other tank here, along with Guardians, who had their range increased talent removed. Luckily, a lot of Paladin spells had decent range anyways, like Judgment, like Avenger's Shield, so it's not as big an impact, but you'll probably need to get used to the reduced Rebuke range. In terms of changes, they're pretty much all in the spec tree, where there was a small shuffle along with a reduction in 2-point nodes, which has been really nice for pathing in the middle of the tree, specifically making it a lot easier to grab those points that amp your Word of Glory healing. Shining Light has also been adjusted in this expansion, now allowing you to store 2 free Word of Glories instead of capping at 1, which is a nice quality of life increase. Even nicer quality of life, though, is the Reworks Sanctuary talent, which now causes you to retain Consecrate's defensive benefits for 4 seconds after leaving it, and let me tell you, this feels amazing. I've been pretty vocal about not enjoying having to play around Consecrate and how it's not fun, but this really removes a lot of my issues with it, as even in heavy movement situations, whether that's a boss fight you have to move a lot for, or Mythic Plus, it's actually not difficult to maintain 100% Consecrate uptime thanks to that 4-second grace period. It doesn't matter how far you go, right? You can steed immediately out of your Consecrate. You still got 4 seconds. You can move a super long distance and then drop another Consecrate within 4 seconds, and you've had Consecrate buff that entire time. It feels really good. And if you were someone who really disliked that Consecrate gameplay, it does still exist, of course, but it is so much more forgiving to play around, so something to keep in mind there. For the hero trees, they've got 2 distinct playstyles here, so let's start with the Hammer Slinging Templar. This basically turns your Eye of Tyr into a one-time use 3 holy power cost spender that deals big damage. It gives you an absorb shield and a short buff that you can then extend, and this buff basically just allows your abilities to shoot off more of these hammers. The whole name of the game here is to try and extend this buff and keep it active as long as possible, because if you shoot out enough hammers, eventually you get a free use of that big spender. So having uptime, 100% uptime ideally, on mobs or bosses is very important for this tree. If you're able to play it well, it does feel very rewarding because you can kind of chain these abilities and never drop this buff, or only drop it for like 10 seconds at a time. But it definitely seems like it's going to be a bit punishing in any situation where you don't have uptime. So if you look at like a boss fight where you have to be running, or there's an intermission, or you're running between Mythic Plus packs or RP and Mythic Plus, right, that really hurts this talent tree. Looking at the competing hero talent tree, you've got Lightsmith, which instead leans into the support fantasy of Paladin, giving you additional Shining Light procs for off-healing or self-healing, as well as the ability to buff allies with weapons or grant shields with the new ability Holy Armament. This has a 1-minute CD baseline and just kind of alternates between being a weapon buff or a shield buff with each cast. It also grants the buff to yourself when you cast it on an ally, so you don't need to choose between giving it to someone else or yourself, which is very nice. Also, if you do want to cast on yourself because you're lazy, or you accidentally do it, whatever it is, it will also buff a nearby ally, so you're not wasting a buff by putting it on yourself either. Now, this tree does come with a very significant problem, and that is the extra Shining Light procs, actually. So these don't actually reduce the mana cost of Word of Glory. They make the holy power cost 0, but the mana cost is not. So because you have a lot of these, and because you're incentivized to spend them because they CDR your Holy Armament ability, you actually go relatively quickly just by using these free procs, which feels very weird, right? Even if you do 0 other Word of Glory casts and only use Shining Light procs or Word of Glory, you will go at about 3 minutes in combat. So hopefully that gets fixed, that gets addressed. Otherwise, it's something that Lightsmith players should be aware of. In general, you've got a few more options in the middle of your talent tree now. Managing Consecrate is significantly easier, and for players interested in a more supportive playstyle as a tank player, that is available to you, all on top of the already extremely useful utility kit that Paladins have. So if that's not something that you want to play, Paladin's got to be your go-to. That brings us to the other prot, Warriors, who are in a similar boat as Druids after receiving adjustments to their class tree, but no real major changes to their spec tree. The changes they did receive are pretty nice though, with Shockwave moving out of the capstone area and becoming significantly more accessible, as well as Thunderclap Spreading Rend just becoming baseline to the spec. Otherwise though, not really much has changed in terms of what talent you're taking or how the spec plays moving into War Within. There's less of a penalty to being in defensive stance, so that's probably something you're going to want to be in for most of the time now, as battle stance is extremely minor, but otherwise, not really a ton to talk about. So let's talk hero trees then. Mountain Thane has been something that I've found really satisfying to play, particularly in Mythic Plus. Basically, this gives Thunderclap, Revenge, and Execute a chance to shoot lightning at targets, and this lightning can give you extra rage. It AoEs around the target and proc shield slams, and it can even give you a few seconds of Avatar. On top of that, you can get procs that empower your Thunderclap, making it a Thunder Blast, giving it a cool new animation and sound, and making it hit really, really hard. This definitely reminds me of the very Thunderclap heavy prot warrior from a couple expansions back, which I really enjoyed at the time, but outside of the minor occasional rotational adjustment favoring, things like Thunder Blast, this is basically just prot warrior as you know it currently, but lightning-y. Your other option here is Colossus, which focuses more on burst damage windows, while also giving your bleeds a decent boost. Basically, you get this new button in Demolish on a 45-second cooldown, and then your shield slams stack up this damage buff for your next Demolish, as well as a damage buff for things like Revenge and bleeds, like I just mentioned, up to 10 stacks here. After that stack cap, if you keep hitting shield slams, it actually CDRs Demolish, so you can get it back a little quicker. This is pretty minor at the moment, but maybe could be more impactful later on down the line in the expansion as you get more stats, because basically what you want to do is line up your Demolish casts with your cooldowns, just hit for an absurd amount of damage. Something to note, Demolish is a channel, but don't worry, you can still block, parry, dodge, use defensives, you're immune to stuns, you're immune to knockbacks while you're channeling to get a small DR, so that helps make it a lot less scary to use as a tank while you're tanking things, so don't need to worry about that. And honestly, it does feel very satisfying to play this spec, to line up all your CDs right and just hit like a truck when you cast that empowered Demolish. Overall, warrior gameplay is a lot of the same in the War Within, regardless of what hero tree you pick, but they have a decent variety in terms of damage profile, at least, with the more sustained and burstier options available. So if you were one of the 10 prot warrior enjoyers still in Dragonflight playing the spec, this offers the same fast-paced gameplay with some minor tweaks that I really enjoyed. Finally, we've got our 6th tank in Vengeance Demon Hunter, who received the fewest changes of the bunch, which does make sense, seeing as they were recently reworked in Season 3 of Dragonflight. That being said, there was an extremely impactful nerf to their double sigil talent, now only granting a second sigil of Flame and some CDR to that specific sigil instead of doubling all of your sigils. This was, of course, a bit expected based on how powerful that talent was, and it does have some significant effects on the gameplay of the spec, as you're now likely taking the double Fiery Brand talent in both Raid and Mythic Plus now, which I know some players did enjoy and some players did not. The hero trees both have their little rotation quirks on top of that, so let's start with Felsguard. Basically, anytime you go into meta, whether that be from using the ability itself, whether that be from Feldev with Demonic Talented, or even proccing Last Resort, it empowers select abilities for the entire duration of that meta. Plus, your first cast of each of these empowered abilities does what's called a Demon Surge around you, dealing a big burst of damage to all nearby enemies. For Feldev, this empowers Soul Cleave and Spirit Bomb, whereas Meta and Last Resort empower those along with Imma Aura, Sigil of Flame, and Feldev itself, while also resetting the cooldown of your Sigil of Flame and Feldev in the process. So essentially here, you want to make sure you press each of the empowered abilities once anytime you go into their respective meta forms, and then you continue your rotation as normal outside of that. Because this tree does give you some resets on Feldev, You get a nice boost to meta uptime. Plus, you also get a bunch of passive nodes making you tankier outside of meta as well, which is making this look like a very nice option for Mythic Plus to help shore up some of Vengeance's issues early on in expansions when they have less stats in terms of defensive coverage. Their other choice is another burst tier option with Eldrazi Reaver, where consuming 20 soul fragments empowers your next throw glaive to be a Reaver's glaive, enhancing your next soul cleave to do 3 extra hits, and fracture to apply a 7% damage taken increase to your target for 20 seconds. The key here is that the second of these two abilities that you use after they're empowered will actually have its effect doubled. So if you throw your Reaver's Glaive and then you Soul Cleave and then you Fracture, you'll apply a 14% damage taken increase to your target, which can be pretty impactful when combined with some of the other amps in your kit, like the Fiery Demise, as well as the 20% damage and healing amp that you just get from using both enhancements from Eldrazi Reaver itself. You also get a free use of this Reaver's Glaive when you cast Hunt, on top of just generally increased soul generation throughout the tree, which again has been really helpful for Vengeance as a spec that I found kind of relied on having, a lot of haste, a lot of the other stats to feel good to play throughout Dragonflight, so helping to bring that up the baseline of the spec a bit here. To conclude, the spec did lose a fair bit moving into the War Within, but I think they have some really great options with their 2 hero trees that help to compensate for some of their historical weaknesses early on in expansions. And I personally do enjoy the whole double brand playstyle in Keys, so if you're also a brand enjoyer, it may be good to look at Vengeance going into next expansion. But there we have it, guys. Those are the big changes and how the hero trees play out for all 6 tank specs going into the War Within. What are you guys planning to main when the expansion drops later this month? Let me know down in the comments below, and make sure you subscribe for more tank and guide content, including, like I mentioned, that tank loot video coming very soon, my tank rankings for launching, of course, raid and dungeon guides as well. Otherwise, thank you to my Patreons for their continued support, and I'll see everyone in the next video.